Hey there everybody, it's Mark Curley. I'm back with another How to Draw video. Today we're going to be talking about adding detail, and I'm going to compare three different versions of essentially the same drawing. One with a relatively small amount of detail, one with considerably more, and then finally the last one where we go crazy, packing in as much detail as possible. And so I'm going to begin in real time adding some details to this drawing. My idea is to have this woman walking down the street, one of these narrow alleyways in, say, Tokyo, where there's, in a back alley, sometimes you see these little restaurants and all. It's kind of a natural place for detail to get packed in. Because, well, if you've ever been in such a location, you'll know what I'm talking about, that there's just insane amounts of natural detail in that location. That's why I chose this. But I'm going to begin adding like little awnings and stuff for the various businesses that we're going to have her walking past. And as I do, I want to talk a little bit about the use of detail. I've always been kind of addicted, really, to detail, to adding detail to my drawings ever since I was a little kid. Especially when you're young, I think you associate detail with a display of skill. And you may believe that, the more detail, the better you are as an artist. That it's a kind of a simplistic way of thinking that a lot of people can kind of fall into. And then as you get older, you begin to realize that there's this competing philosophy of, less is more. That sometimes you can overwork a drawing with detail, and that you would have been better off keeping it a little more simple. So this actually, none of these is going to be true minimalism. I think we're going to have a fair amount of detail even in this first one, but I'm trying my best at the outset here to come up with something that's going to be a little more, let's say, impressionistic, where you just have the bare lines and it's kind of left to the viewer's imagination as to to fill in all the remaining details. That can be one of the reasons for not adding loads of detail, is that you're sort of inviting the viewer to take part in the illustration in a way that they are completing it by way of their own imagination. That being said, like I said, I love adding detail, and if you've seen my book, my graphic novel series, Brody's Ghost, it is filled with detail in almost every single frame. Some of them where the detail almost becomes the subject of the illustration. That this is all about giving you the I tend to use detail for locations. An illustration like this is typical of where I will really pull out the stops and add loads of detail to give, especially like in a comic book situation, to give viewers a sense of being in that world. And the more, I figure, the more detail you add, the more the reader understands that world, and maybe the reality of that world becomes more effective. They believe in that location. It's like they can kind of close their eyes and picture what it's like to be there. And that's kind of my thinking, especially in these location shots. That's my thinking behind adding lots and lots of detail. Well, I think I've probably talked enough. Boy, Curly, you sure do like to talk. I've talked enough about my reasoning, or the sort of justification behind a low detail version of the drawing. Let's go ahead and finish this up in time lapse, and I think I probably will also ink a little bit. And then my plan is to scan this into the computer, print it out, and then use that as the basis of this continuing version in which I add increasingly more detail, and then we can finally compare all three different versions. So give me a moment here. I'm going to continue working on this first illustration, and we will be right back. Alright, so as you can see, this is, it's got some details in it, but it has this slightly unfinished look to it, I'd say. And I've decided, kind of on the spur of the moment, to pull out a marker and add just one shade of color to this illustration. I'm going to add blue. And the reason that I'm doing this is I wanted to explain that sometimes you don't add loads and loads of detail because you want to leave space for the color, in the sense that if you add too much detail, you kind of crowd out the color, whereas if you do an illustration with very little detail, you're leaving space for the color to come in and sort of have a more important job to do, compared to if you had filled it all up with line work. So, yeah, I hadn't really planned to do this video this way, but I think actually it can have a nice double lesson aspect to it, because adding just this one shade of color, I think you'll agree it already is starting to make this look a little more complete, and it certainly is creating a nice effect. I think you see this kind of illustration sometimes in shoujo manga. Generally not with the color blue, but maybe like gray tones. But it has that same feeling of they've left some space. Artists, art teachers will talk about letting a drawing breathe. That if you add too much shading, too much detail, that you somehow you've covered up too much of the white of the page, and it can kind of kill the drawing. We talk about overworking a drawing, the hazards of overworking a drawing, and we'll probably talk about that a little more later on as this thing continues, in the sense of the reason why people don't tend to make drawings with detail over every single square inch of the picture is that it can have this, there can be sort of diminishing returns, and that you actually, instead of having a nice effect, you overwork it, you just, you go too far, and suddenly a drawing that looked good 10 minutes ago just isn't looking good anymore. So anyway, I thought I'd go ahead and do that and just show how you can add a tiny bit of color. I might add some more later on to kind of finish off this illustration. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and scan this in, and then we are going to go on to the second version, taking this exact same illustration, dropping it in here, and then adding more detail to it. Alright, so, looking at it now, I think no one would claim that this is a drawing that has no details at all. But certainly it will seem relatively low detail compared to this next one once I'm done with it. Now, I'm just going straight in with ink at this stage because so much of it has already been established, but I may have to bring out the pencil for certain aspects of the drawing as we go along. But let's just talk about, the effects of doing this sort of mid-level of detail before we go into the super extreme version. One thing that you can do with detail is use it as a way of creating depth, so that if I add a lot of extra line work to these foreground images and leave it relatively blank in the background, that can be a great way of adding depth to the illustration. And indeed, it sort of simulates the effect of vision that most people can see more details of the buildings that are closer, and as they are farther away, and especially on even a slightly foggy day or something like that, the details tend to vanish. And so that's one benefit of not covering every single square inch of the surface with detail, is that you can get that effect of depth. And in fact, I'm probably going to be doing that quite deliberately for this one as an example of sort of a controlled, selective use of detail. where there's method to your madness. You are making choices as to where the detail goes. Whereas maybe with this one, not so much. I suppose there is that same kind of effect of, to whatever degree there is detail, it tends to be confined more to these areas that are closer to us. Now, one effect that you have here is that because she has most of the tight detail, like in her hair and clothing, that she remains the focus of the illustration. And I think what happens as you add detail is you've got to add detail to her if indeed you want her to continue to sort of pop out in the illustration. And, to some degree this becomes a matter of darks and lights, just as much as it relates to detail, by adding, anything that has extra levels of black in it is going to draw the eye and sort of signal this is the important part of the illustration. So there's kind of two different things going on there, the dark and light aspect as well as the addition of detail. But, I could go on and on. You have heard me do so in the past, indefinitely almost. But let me go ahead and continue adding detail throughout this sort of mid-level version of the drawing. I may just go straight from there and scan it in. I don't know, I suppose if I have something to say, I'll come back and talk a little bit. But otherwise, we are quickly moving on to that third sort of detail fest, detail palooza in the last one. Well, I think it's going to be sort of fun to see. So let's go ahead and move on and finish up this middle version of the drawing. Alright, so you can see I had to actually come back in and start beefing up the color a little bit, and that is an effect of adding, when you have as much detail as I began to put into this illustration, that original approach to the coloring just was not sufficient to have the color hold its own with all this line work. So that's sort of an interesting thing that occurred. And indeed, what you see here is probably equivalent to the kind of thing I was doing in Brody's Ghost, probably even more detailed, frankly. I'm trying to go for this effect of bringing the foreground closer to us by way of adding increasing amounts of detail. But that's nothing compared to what we're going to do over here. So I'm going to go ahead, scan this in, print it out, and let's see what happens when we really, truly go crazy with the detail. Okay, so thus far I've been working in using techniques that I might actually use in a real published piece of work. At this point, just for fun, I am going to begin working in a style that I don't think I would ever use, and that is to say larding this illustration up with detail in really every conceivable spot. And in a way, it's kind of a cautionary tale of what can happen when you go too far with detail. But, I'm always hesitant, even when I say something like that, to say, this is going too far. You should never do this, because never say never. I think when it comes to matters of art, there may be a project or a drawing within a project in which you make the decision this one needs to be crawling with detail, every last square inch of it. But certainly we're going to see this effect that I think we've achieved here with the foreground coming forward and the background dropping away. You are going to see that effect neutralized as I continue to add, the equal amount of detail back here that I was adding in the foreground over here. Now, I think the truth is, a lot of people might say, somewhere between these two is probably my ideal. And yes, I would probably agree with that. This one may be going a little too far already with detail, but I thought, I wanted in a way to show the real extreme with this last one, and so as to kind of lay the groundwork for that, I allowed myself to go pretty far in terms of the details on this one illustration, but you can see already that there is, you reach this point where you're kind of automatically adding detail without even thinking about it, and that is the one area of art where I begin to come out and say, yeah, you know, anytime you're automatically doing something without giving any thought or decision making to the process at all, I do wonder, you got to ask yourself, are you still doing your best work when you're kind of on autopilot? And especially my thinking is that whenever, if you have fallen into a rut of doing something by default, just because it has worked for you in the past, that kind of thing, that's where I think you're in trouble as an artist. You shouldn't be just doing, you know, something automatically without even thinking because someone praised you for it in the past and said, whoa, look at all that detail, you know, or something like that. And it should be a choice that has to do with the storytelling or the effect that you're trying to achieve. Anyway, let's go ahead and continue with this. I'm even going to add some buildings back here. My idea really is to get every last square inch of this illustration literally crawling with detail, and then we can, you know, make a comparison between this one and see if anything has been lost or if anything has been gained with the addition of detail over here. So let's go ahead and finish this up, and I will be back to have a few final words about all three versions of the illustration. Alright, well there you see a version of the drawing that I would never normally do, one that really looks overworked to me, frankly. When you put this many lines into the drawing, it sort of dissolves into a muddy sea of gray, and you can't really see anything anymore. The detail has kind of passed its point of usefulness, and we've all had this experience of working on a drawing for just a little too long, and you regret it, and you're like, man, it looked so much better half an hour ago. I should have just stopped at that stage. But, you know, as I said, I don't like to say this is wrong, you should never work this way, because some of you out there might actually prefer this third version as your favorite version of the drawing. Let me know what you think in the comments section. But for now, I want to say thank you to anyone who has chosen to support me by getting any of my books, like The Realism Challenge, my book on hyper-realistic illustration work, The Drawing Lesson, a graphic novel that teaches you how to draw, and of course, Mastering Manga, my series of books, 1, 2, and 3, on drawing in a manga style. But I think it's time, in fact, I think it's past time that I laid down this pen. Probably should have stopped quite a while ago. I do want to thank you all, though, for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back with another one real soon.